I think one of the things about the Heritable Innovation Trust is that because we started in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, people come to the conclusion that you have to have indigenous peoples and they have to be living in a remote village, and it's all kinds of mystical things going from all over the place. And the fact is the Heritable Innovation Trust model works wherever you go. There is a very interesting challenge right in the middle of the United States in St. Louis, with a city that has had one of those great experiences of being kind of the center of the universe for a while, and kind of a point where everybody knows that industry is working, and the intersection between the agricultural heartland and the industrial heartland are all coming together. And it has this very vibrant, very short, but very vibrant history. And then all of a sudden things start falling apart. And as things start falling apart, people start trying to figure out, what is the identity of St. Louis? What is St. Louis about? What is it going to be about? Does it have a future? Is it going down the pathway of a saw and lumber mill up in the Northwest? Is it going the pathway of an automotive town in Michigan? Is it going the way of a mill town in North Carolina? You know, what's the future of St. Louis? And so we've decided to start with a Heritable Innovation Trust framework in St. Louis too, which once again starts with the question of, what do you have in abundance? Well, St. Louis has a bunch of things in abundance, not the least of which is the phenomenons created by the geology of St. Louis, where for many, many years the breweries actually were built atop of and around underground giant caverns, which were places that were very thermally stable and very, very ideal for the storage and the use of the production of beer and so forth. And so there was an enormous amount of value in the native ecosystem of St. Louis, which had a lot of utility, much beyond what it was being used for or even known about. You can think, for the sake of argument, in fact this is just happening as we're speaking, you can think about the amount of money that is spent cooling server farms, where you have very large amounts of data having to be stored in sensitive locations and so forth and so on, and tons and tons and tons of air conditioning units to attempt to try to keep things cool. You can imagine what it would be like to use cavern systems as a natural cooled environment to actually put giant server farms, where we're not trying to put tons of air conditioning into place, which is the giant powered drain on server farms. There are tons of things that you could use these things for, but what we've done is we've started with a statement of, what does St. Louis have in abundance? And here's where it gets interesting. St. Louis has an aging water system in abundance. It has a failing municipal waste system in abundance. It has installed infrastructure for manufacturing in abundance. It has transportation systems that are not optimized for today in abundance. It has a whole bunch of things in abundance, and it turns out that most of the things in abundance are actually things that humans put there, and the context in which they were put there no longer has relevance. But they have those in abundance. And so what we're beginning to do in St. Louis is start with the, what do you have in abundance? Then look at the custom and culture in St. Louis and say, what are the types of things, what are the activities that have brought community together in St. Louis? And it turns out that St. Louis has a number of things that brought communities together. There's a very large influence of the church there. There's a very large influence of the preservation of a core set of community values, which are deeply and communally held. There are a number of things about appropriate and inappropriate types of things to engage in. So much like the indigenous communities we work with in the Pacific, St. Louis has, in a different manifestation, a lot of the same dynamics. And it turns out that by starting with the what do you have in abundance, you start looking at the degree to which those things which are in St. Louis right now serve as the germ for new opportunities that come out of what's there in abundance. St. Louis has been challenged for years in trying to figure out how it brings back manufacturing, or how it brings back something that was a nostalgic reflection of the past. And the answer is St. Louis is not going to bring something back. The thing that's going to happen in St. Louis next is going to be a new thing. And so what we're talking about there is identifying those pieces of the puzzle that we have in abundance, and then figuring out how you repurpose, reuse, or potentially entirely disassemble and keep the commodities, if you will, that are there, but come up with new ways to use them. So you actually start using solid waste and liquid waste as energy sources. You start using old building artifacts as ways to do thermal storage and thermal power generation. You look at all of the dynamics of the land and the landforms as ways to do alternative industry opportunities. You actually engage St. Louis not as the city that a company left or the city that an opportunity left, but you actually start engaging St. Louis as the place where the fruitful productivity, the abundant enterprise of St. Louis, is going to be an entirely new vision. So in Brazil, in 1 month from now, we will have the opportunity to engage in a conversation about eco-cities and eco-villages, which is a program that we're working on in St. Louis, which is to create living environments where the communities of St. Louis can live and have gardening, have organic food production, have organic energy production and use, have water recycling programs, have micro businesses around creating water recycling programs that actually use the raw materials that are the legacies of the industrial past of St. Louis, where we're not talking about taking something new from the earth. We're talking about taking what's already been put there and repurposing it so that it can be used for a new value. The irony of what's happening in St. Louis is that the same program we're doing there is exactly the same program we've done in the Pacific. The methodology is the same. The implementation steps are the same. The discovery of repurposing of assets are the same. The opportunity to look at alternative units of value creation and exchange are the same. And what we're finding is the similarities between what we're doing in an indigenous community that's persisted for 30,000 years and a city in the United States which has existed for less than 200 winds up being the same thing.